Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final video in this series where we're going to be talking about the conclusion of all of these topics together, really wrapping them up and asking some final questions. So let's go ahead and jump straight into the presentation that I've prepared. Um, and let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so once again, this is the final video for Political Economy of the American Empire. And to give you an outline of what I'm going to be discussing in this video, I'm actually going to do a brief overview of all the topics we've considered, and then take a step back and start discussing some of those big questions that were posed in that very first introductory video. And then we're going to talk about some of the relationships between racism and capitalism and come to some final conclusions. So let me go ahead and jump straight into that overview. So in our first video, we began by talking about settler colonialism as the deliberate mission of those first Americans to eliminate and replace Native peoples in order to acquire their quote unquote free land, of course, at the cost of extreme violence, really. They used violence and they used strategic economic tactics like cutting off all trade routes in order to begin to acquire this land that would form not only the basis of American wealth as a whole, but the basis of the US government's wealth. And this all occurred through the strategic dispossession and genocide of Native peoples. In the next week, we began to talk about slavery as the impetus behind settler colonialism, really, and as creating that demand for land that would allow them to increase the land base over time. And we talked about how through the acquisition of free land, but also quote unquote free labor, in other terms, violent slavery, they were able to produce cheap cotton that uh, basically fueled industrialization in the North, along with some other factors like a line of credit being opened precisely because of this plantation system. This allowed the United States to begin to industrialize and to outcompete other nations in global markets. So industrial development, we discussed, really would not have been possible without the acquisition of free land and free labor through genocide and through slavery. In other words, we discussed this original economy as being one whose, quote, bottom gear was torture. That was a quote from Matthew Desmond that we had mentioned. In the next two videos, we followed up with both the indigenous population and the Black American population. So in the indigenous experience, we talked about the rise of the reservation system as beginning in approximately the 1850s, and then the development of a legal structure, otherwise known as the trust doctrine, that forms the relationship between tribal governments and the United States government. And we talked about how the trust doctrine and how also tribal sovereignty is a part of that is also deeply colonial in nature and maintains the power of the United States over these tribes and their decision making. And then we also discussed the final attempt at termination of Native peoples and their tribal status in the 50s through 70s, and how at the end of this in the 1970s, after the American Indian movement, we continued to see, not only that majority of Native Americans were living in urban areas and off of reservations, but that there were disproportionate outcomes right up until the modern day. Then we looked at the fate of Black Americans after emancipation. Right after emancipation, we began to see a rise of a restrictive system for labor opportunities, but also what would become discriminatory banking and credit practices, as well as the violent destruction of any wealth accumulated by these communities. And then we talked about the use of cheap labor in the South, first in agriculture through things like sharecropping, but then later on, after the Great Migration to the North, in segregated areas of the North, once again, Black populations became a source of cheap labor. This, of course, ends after the civil rights movement, at least on paper. Legally, segregation ends, but we know many of the effects continued on far after the fact and continue to the modern day. And then we saw at this point also the rise of mass incarceration, which we discussed in further depth in that last week. So then returning to, after the end of slavery in the 1850s, after the end of settler colonialism, which it's hard to put an end or, a definite end to, but the Indian Wars really come to an end in the 1890s. At the same point, American expansion has defined the United States. And Americans are really facing a question of, is this the end of the period of American expansion? And what we find is that, no, it's not. Because just years after the end of continental expansion, we see the United States go abroad and take the same tactics, even commanders from the Indian Wars, and launch wars abroad. At this point, it's for access to resources and markets in order to benefit the existing industry in the United States. And at this point, we also see the rise of American colonies, some who gain independence and some who may remain quote unquote territories to the modern day. By the end of World War II, we also see the development of neocolonial institutions, which is the subject of our next video. And in these neocolonial institutions, the United States was the predominant voice and holder of power, I guess, in these institutions. So while the United States held majority of the power and voting power in these institutions, it really wasn't until the 1970s that they began to exert this power to their benefit. So in the 1970s, in the international debt crisis, we saw the rise of neoliberal policies really pushed by the United States that would allow American industry to dominate foreign markets while essentially crippling domestic industry for many developing nations. At this point, the United States also begins to access cheap labor abroad in a larger capacity, because as industry is wiped out, as protectionism is wiped out, there's a new source of cheap labor in these countries for the United States. So we also see the rise of multinational corporations that use this cheap labor from abroad. And then we look at immigration and exploitation. Immigration is in part fueled by interventionism and neocolonialism, actually to a large extent in recent times. But the story of immigration, as we describe it, begins with settler colonialism. So it begins with the arrival of those wanting to eliminate and replace Native peoples through an ever-increasing white population. But it also begins with the original slaves, who were forced migrants. And then we see that it's not so much a story of gradual expansion, but a story of deliberate exclusion of populations from immigrant status or from citizenship, and they're reduced largely to laborers. This is especially true for Chinese populations, and especially true for Mexican populations, but it includes others. By the 1960s, once again with the civil rights movement, we see that racialized citizenship restrictions and quotas disappear. But now we see the appearance of restrictions on border crossing, which leads to the rise of an entire illegal caste of immigrants who are now permanently stuck in the United States as a exploitable labor force. And we see the rise of a system of the new Jim Crow, or a secondary legal caste, which also very much connects to our last video on the rise of mass incarceration. This rise is especially, chronologically pinpointed as beginning with the, end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s. Once again, after the civil rights movement, the Republican Party is looking to bring back white poor voters to the party. So they begin these policies to, both kind of react to the civil rights movement and say, we're going to take care of those people, quote unquote, take care. And at the same time, this is taking place right as, once again, because of these neo-colonial institutions, we're accessing cheap labor abroad, and we no longer really need the Black cheap labor that has been maintained in the United States. So we see the rise of unemployment among Black populations, we see the rise of poverty, and instead of creating a welfare program, we move towards a carceral state, with ever increasing amounts of money being put towards prisons and police, and a disproportionate amount of people of color being placed into these systems of mass incarceration, even though crime rates are virtually the same uh, between racial groups. So once again, this disappears the problems that we're seeing arising in society, those associated with unemployment and poverty, and it creates a secondary legal caste, one that is now entrenched in our modern economy as well through the private prison system, through private vendors, lobbying, so on and so forth. And also, the expenditure of our government. So this is where we bring it all to an end. And we stop our narrative here with these 8 subjects. All right. So now that we've done a bit of a review, you might recall that in our first week, we did an introductory activity about the rise of an empire. And I asked you all, how did America reach its status as the greatest economic superpower? Or in other words, sorry, how did it become an economic empire? And I told you to write these and put them somewhere safe so you can return to it later on. Now would be that time. So if you have that activity saved somewhere, go ahead and look back at it and look at how did you describe the United States economic rise before this class. And then I want you to think about how would you describe it now? Would you make any additions? Would you make any changes? What do you even think about what you had originally written? Do you think it's still valid, or no, you would change a lot of your thinking? All right, but now I want to kind of gear us towards some big questions about these topics. One of these is, in our first week, we also talked a lot about myths and common tropes about the American economy and how it became successful. Some of those were about immigrants, some of those, and being a nation of immigrants, some of those were about innovation. And we talked about 2 predominant ones about free markets and economic markets as making us more successful. And secondly, about hardworking individuals and the toil of Americans being kind of this impetus behind the massive growth of the American economy. So I want to ask, when can we pinpoint the rise of these tropes, or what I term here, the myth of the market in our American history? Where does it fall into the chronology that we've described? So if you want, just sit with that question for a minute. But I'd also like to make a suggestion. I think you're probably thinking the same thing, which is that we've come time and time again to point out this period of the end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s, right after the Civil Rights Movement, as being a point where the rhetoric really changes. You can no longer discriminate on grounds of race. Racism cannot be explicit in public. So instead, we see the rise of rhetoric around markets. We see the elimination of any kind of legal discrimination on grounds of race, but the rise of instead saying markets will bring true liberty, markets will bring true economic freedom. We see this with the idea of Black capitalism that we talked about in the video on post-emancipation. So I'd like to make the argument that if these myths originate anywhere, it might be from this same period, the end of the 60s, the rise in the 70s, and they continue in many ways till the modern day. And I'd like to ask a secondary question. So, if that period represents the elimination of racialized policies and institutions, are there still modern forms of discrimination? And what are they? So, I'll give you a second to think about this and go ahead and pause if you'd like to. But otherwise, I'm going to make, once again, a few suggestions. One thing that we've talked about time and time again, especially in our last two videos, is about the rise of the new Jim Crow, or the rise of a secondary caste of those who are illegal or criminals who can be discriminated against on grounds of the fact that they have broken the law. This is another type of discrimination that excludes people in many ways from opportunity and from the things that are associated with American citizenship and rights, basic rights. Uh, that's one form of discrimination. But I'd also like to raise the question of, are markets themselves discriminatory? We have seen in our statistics that up until the modern day, there continues to be inequality in outcomes for Indigenous peoples who disproportionately do worse when it comes to education, income, wealth. The same for Black Americans. We saw that even since the end of the civil rights movement, even since the Kerner Commission to the modern day, you know, there's been no change in wealth and no change in income. So the question is, I mean, is the market reinforcing what already was? And the statistics seem to suggest that yes, this is the case. So perhaps markets are discriminatory because they seem to reinforce the existing institutions from beforehand. So yes, I think that's one question to think about, is about the role of markets and the continuing role of markets. And then how do the myth of the market, the fact that that the economy has always functioned this way, how does it legitimize that? But I want to ask one final question here, which is, throughout this course, we've been looking at instances where, I termed it as power has subverted markets. So policies and institutions have allowed the subjugation of particular groups in the economy. But, I want to point out something as well, that while we say these subvert markets, they're also part of an ongoing capitalist system. So when we talk about land theft, just as Native American land is turned into property, that is an important part of the capitalist system that arises in the United States. Just as slaves are used as free labor, or later on discrimination is used to extract cheap labor from particularly vulnerable populations, this is also highly linked to a capitalist system, right? So I want to ask, in what ways are capitalism and racism interlinked? And that's just one way of describing it through looking at a few institutions. But I want to encourage you to start thinking about this connection. And I want to show a video from Angela Davis to speak to this subject, because she does a wonderful job of talking about this link and what I think is, redefining our description of American capitalism. So I'm going to go ahead and play that video.
Can you talk about racism and capitalism? You often write and speak about how they are intimately connected, and talk about a world that you envision.
Yeah, racism is integrally linked to capitalism, and I think it's a mistake to assume that we can combat racism by leaving capitalism in place. As Cedric Robinson pointed out in his book, Black Marxism, capitalism is racial capitalism. And of course, to just say for a moment that Marx pointed out that what he called primitive accumulation, capital doesn't just appear from nowhere. The original capital was provided by the labor of slaves, the Industrial Revolution, which pivoted around the production of capital was enabled by slave labor in the US. So I'm convinced that the ultimate eradication of racism is going to require us to move toward a more socialist organization of our economies, of our other institutions. I think we have a long way to go before we can begin to talk about an economic system that is not based on exploitation and on the super exploitation of Black people, Latinx people, and other racialized populations. But I do think that we now have the conceptual means to engage in discussions, popular discussions about capitalism. Occupy gave us new language. The notion of the prison industrial complex requires us to understand the globalization of capitalism. Anti-capitalist consciousness helps us to understand the predicament of immigrants who are barred from the US by the wall that has been created by the current occupant. These conditions have been created by global capitalism. And I think this is a period during which we need to begin that process of popular education, which will allow people to understand the interconnections of racism, heteropatriarchy, capitalism.
All right, so I think this sets us up for our last discussion of this series of videos. And the question is, if racism and capitalism are indeed deeply interlinked, and the myth of the market continues to reinforce the inequality that has arisen from the institutions that we've looked at and the policies that we've looked at from history, how can we begin to move forward? What are the necessary steps? And where do we begin? And I think this is a tough question, and it's asking a lot, but we have to begin to consider this. Where do we start if both the economic system and these deeply embedded views and biases are interlinked with one another? And I'd like to raise something that came up with my students in my class, which is time and time again, it seems that we came to the conclusion that a great part of this has to do with education. And really that in order to achieve any type of justice on these issues, we have to begin with education and educating ourselves. You can specifically look at the discussion we had on the topic of post-emancipation America, where in our discussion, Mersat Bardaran suggested that before we go to things like reparations, we have to first begin discussing truth and reconciliation, coming to understand one another, discussing the history, learning from one another. And I think, that's a really important point, is what role does education play with this? Where do we really begin? So I'd like to leave us with that. But I also do, before we conclude, I want to make a final point here, which is that, much of this course seems to suggest that a lot of these policies are deeply embedded. A lot of these biases as well are deeply embedded, and their effects continue on very much into the modern day. And some of them are modern institutions, like those based off of criminality or illegality. So it's a bit of a dismal picture, I think. But I want to point out that there's also reason to have hope. There have been points in history where we have had the capacity to look back, to reflect, and it's created an opportunity to move forward, but we haven't always gone that way. So the Kerner Commission, for example, they really were able to come to some conclusions that I think, most people wouldn't expect from the United States government itself. To be able to look back at this history, to acknowledge what these policies have done, and say that real change needs to be made. But it shows that we're capable of this. It shows that if we really reflect, we are capable of coming to new understandings and moving forward. Unfortunately, that wasn't what happened. That resolution was rejected, but it shows our capacity. And furthermore, despite the many actions that have been really detrimental, um, the United States population, like as Americans, we are also highly idealistic. And I think that's something that should also give us hope for the future. In our conversation on interventionism, Kinzer brought up that quote where he says, "We choose to focus on World War II because it's one of those instances that shows us as we want to see ourselves, as bringing freedom, as bringing liberation." So it's instances like those that show we have this high ideal, but we don't always live true to it. But it's reason to be hopeful as well. That if we truly move towards that ideal, that if we really, come towards understanding, not only do we have the capacity for it, as we've seen, but we can begin to move forward. So I'd like to leave us with that thought. Let me stop sharing my screen. That despite the history, there is really reason to be hopeful for the future. And it's a lesson for us to continue to educate ourselves, to continue to speak about these topics with others. And in doing this, we can come a bit closer to a new understanding and a bit closer to justice for these topics. So I'd like to stop there. And I thank you so much for watching these videos. It's definitely been a pleasure getting to preparing them, and I have myself learned so much from this entire process. So I always encourage you to leave your thoughts in the comments section. Um, any final thoughts on uh, the entire course itself, on these final questions I'm posing, on ways to move forward. Um, but I hope this leaves you with a little bit of hope and a lot more understanding. So thank you so much, and bye.